third-year thesis students, and it's very exciting to now hear her talk tonight, What Would Cornelia Do? So Julie, as the inaugural laureate of the Oberlander International Prize in Landscape Architecture from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, suggests that the legacy of Cornelia provides a constant reminder that good design isn't enough. Environmental regeneration, social equity, savvy resourcefulness, and sheer joy are also required. But while Julie might be honoring Cornelia with this question, she's not really known for always following, or even caring about what everyone else might think. Their expectations. She's forthright, unafraid to provoke debate and to tease out what really matters most about a place. So Julie credits Michael van Valkenburg, Frederick Law Olmsted, artist Robert Smithson for helping her transition from her early studies as a sculptor to develop a passion for the land, where she's known as the reigning toxic beauty queen of brownfield remediation and the fairy godmother of industrial wastelands. So Julie spent the last 30 years educating a generation of landscape architects, including myself, and pursuing groundbreaking work through her firm, D.I.R.T Studio. So whether D.I.R.T actually stands for Design Investigations Reclaiming Terrain, or Dump It Right There, it's a critical design practice with a portfolio of resourceful, robust landscapes, thoroughly researched, engaging, innovative, and ecologically based technologies. To Julie and her work, challenges are opportunities, and sustainability is just common sense. So through her meticulous study of her sites, she renders layers legible and accessible, gives form to dynamic processes, and uses or reuses materials with an artistic vengeance. She gives landscape a voice and creates extraordinary yet grounded and authentic places. So Julie says she lets form and process emerge from a place. Yet I would say the voice she gives landscape is not quiet. It's more like a shout or even a roar. And her passion and artistry really create projects that are exuberant and whose significance in forging new directions for our field can't be denied. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the 2023 Hough OALA visiting critic, Julie Bargman, to the podium.
Hey, thanks, Elise. I like to think Elise is one of the many students I've contaminated. Sorry about that. So Cornelia Oberlander, who I know you all know, but she immigrated from Germany, as you probably know, became a comedian, not a comedian, but she was pretty funny, a Canadian, but also a force to be reckoned with. She was a pioneer for a woman in a modernist architect's world, and she's an intrepid and steadfast practitioner. You can see her literally working in the field until she died at the age of 99. I always wanted to be like Cornelia when I grew up. I admired her rigor and her curiosity. And she, as you probably know, championed addressing climate change and said that any landscape architect that wasn't addressing this issue had their head in the sand. Okay. So there's a little bit to live up to and to listen to. Just imagine me sitting on this bench next to her. Now, Julie. She would say generously but firmly, so how could I not have her voice in my head? I took Cornelia's cue to not allow business as usual, and especially the business of industry and their nasty habit of dumping toxic byproducts into the landscape. This fascination with industry started early. It brought on, as a kid of one of 8, riding in a station wagon, riding past the belching refineries on the New Jersey Turnpike. I remember also being curious about the nearby modest homes of the workers in this part of New Jersey where the accent is quite strong. that childhood curiosity grew while I was an art student in Pittsburgh. The steel mills really sealed my obsession that has fueled 3 decades of my life's work. And it's amazing. In fact, just a few years ago, I worked on the regeneration of this very mill. So things do come around. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think in anybody's mind, when they see this map, that the landscape needed some landscape architect's attention. Through both D.I.R.T Studio, through practice and teaching at University of Virginia, I charged into the unknown territory, and D.I.R.T was founded on doing research to probe that industrial business as usual. And teaching meant working with some great students to construct a new body of knowledge, design approaches. So here are some of the stories. It's a bit of a retrospective, I guess because I'm getting old, but it's in 5 parts. I approach working landscapes with empathy and awe, like they are ugly ducklings. And it's important, I think, for us to realize that only 50 years ago, at least in the United States, that thanks to this pioneer, the environment was finally granted rights. And the legislation, of course, brought on accountability, but the regulations for remediation were and remain, unfortunately, very, very flawed. I really actually became really infuriated by these very myopic technologies that were being applied by engineers that were a quick fix, a green veneer, a type of camouflage. Also, reclamation laws did not, hold folks, the EPA, accountable or corporations accountable for authentic consideration of impacted communities. I wanted to find alternatives to remediation, which you can see here is about correcting a fault or an evil. Its synonym being redemption. It's pretty interesting. Instead, I was really looking for another word, and I've, to this date, used regeneration time and time again, which by definition means creating anew. So what would Cornelia encourage me to do? To stick to your guns and make the transformation visible. Oh, that's not supposed to be there. Sorry, wrong one. Let's see. Was I going? There we go. Sorry. Embrace the complexity, challenge the limited engineering approaches, and give form to processes for neighbors to witness. My students dared to reveal what the regulations actually look like spatially on real ground with real neighbors. Here, a student translates very thick data from the EPA's and their operable units, they call them, at the Avtech Superfund site. While another student imagines a completely new kind of novel ecology that would emerge on the polluted floodplain through the use of biotechnologies. And then meanwhile at D.I.R.T, we worked with the EPA in the Copper Basin of Tennessee, and we deciphered this sinister map that there's a pretty intense list of contaminants. The data in real time and in real place looks like this. It included acid rock drainage that turns the water blood red. And the fumes from the smelting furnaces denude the forest vegetation for 52 square miles. So we tried, in this case, to propose a passive treatment system, but the EPA was not up to the task. That happened over and over. But at Vittendale, in the context of a nonprofit and a community-based effort, D.I.R.T joined a fantastic multidisciplinary team to make that transformation visible. The goal was a demonstration project in the coal mining region of southwestern Pennsylvania. It involved getting a crash course on this technology, and very simply in the montage I have here, the unstable aqueous solution, not supposed to call it water, becomes water after going through kind of a turbocharged wetland. This was the site. It's a 40-acre floodplain with a former coking operation. And this is what it's like to work in the mine. We was like, I was talking to students today. I was like, oh, you have such a nice amount of data. But what's it like to be there? And what's it like to have worked there? So these are miners that are in the Catani B seam, which is only 4 feet high, so that they would have to crawl to the work face every day, and sometimes that commute would be 45 minutes long. So you kind of look at the place a little differently when you know that. In fact, up here, these are the mine tunnels to scale with the town here of Vittendale. This is the old coke works, and this is where we were taking note of the kind of cultural presence of the workers, but also a lot of the poems and the songs that were being composed about the coal mining in the region. So in some ways it was simple. A lot of it had to do with translation. Up at the top is a diagram from the hydrogeologist, the engineer. And then down here, the artist Stacy and I were looking at how is it that we could have those forms be legible so that folks could understand the process. And we came up with the concept of a litmus garden. And this is the kind of fancy pants, more neat site plan where you can see that these basins here, you can see the progression there from unstable aqueous solution to biologically rich water going into the final rinse, we called it, of the wetland, and then being discharged. But the discharge is being lifted up and taken and goes through basically this giant washing machine. This is the sequence, of what happens, 1 through 9, of just this, again, this turbocharged wetland. Those are the pH ponds. And here it is. You can see a nice AmeriCorps volunteer in one of the basins for scale. And this is it under construction. Actually, this was us bartering with a local excavation company. They took away some of the slag that had fuel value in exchange for this excavation, this grading. Folks in the town really wanted to help with the planting. And there it is, kind of, it's doing its thing. The next shift. The Vittendale project definitely challenged this linear approach to conventional remediation, making that transformation visible for folks to witness. And two decades earlier, artist Robert Smithson had the same beef, calling out a regulation that would cover over this Bingham Canyon pit. He called it a very Humpty Dumpty way of doing things. His writings absolutely continually echo in my brain to push regeneration into thinking around cycles. That engaging processes, especially in working landscapes, means, in the essence, taking the next shift. It's about the landscape's evolution, not the solution. That designing a course of action allows for the provisional nature of landscapes. So the charge is to take the next shift, to kill anybody that gets in the way with knowledge. Push the processes, not things. Question the motives. And when things get rough, call for backup. Since 1993, my students have been game to look at alternative biotechnologies for the treatment of polluted soil and water, and they're wrestling with how to represent and think about those processes. This should be resonating with some of the students I met with today. While at D.I.R.T, we struggled with doing that with a client, and this is Harvard's development group, who was about to gobble up the modest working town of Allston, Massachusetts, right opposite the main campus in Cambridge. And they actually made the mistake and thought that we didn't know how to read soil maps. We know how to read soil maps. We showed them that thousands of trucks full of dirty dirt and other soil compounds would run through the neighborhood streets. And we said, why not treat the soils on a nearby abandoned Sears site and reuse it locally or at any of the number of the nearby Harvard properties? We called it the D.I.R.T dance, a jumbo operation of cut and fill and treat. And in that case, as in a lot of other projects, we got a pat on the head and shown the door. Meanwhile, in Detroit, Dearborn, Michigan, we had another go at this idea with the Ford Motor Company. And Ford and a great interdisciplinary team, of course, again. And you can see this is 1,200, acres, we say, of burn and funk, churn and burn and funk. And in their 2000 Y2K campaign, they were looking for alternative ways of thinking about reinventing the Rouge river plant. And we found that first and foremost, their approach was extremely conservative. And it was odd that we had to remind them of how important the River Rouge is, as it's been depicted by the artist Charles Sheeler and Diego Rivera. This was a very first quick sketch when I landed in Detroit to conceive of this idea of a level of transparency along this main road where they had, in the 70s, put up soil berms and evergreens. They just did not want people to know what they were up to, and they probably shouldn't have. But now it was time to reveal. So turning that road north and south here, you can see that we wanted to kind of create a narrative along that road about the future, where Bill McDonough did his giant, assembly plant with the largest green roof, blah, blah, blah. But our interest, D.I.R.T's interest, was down having to do with the past and the abandoned coke ovens. So for us, what's kind of embodied energy into soils, albeit good and bad, is just an incredibly culturally rich landscape that should just not be covered up or thrown away. By the way, that's Bonnie Clyde, Bonnie of Bonnie and Clyde. Mean mother. And this was the abandoned coke ovens. Pretty wonderfully sublime. And the idea was simple. We used the word remediation because they had a fit anytime I said regeneration. And it was about curating the site, we made a huge argument with the historian to keep the coke ovens. And then in the foreground, along Miller Road, have these remediation gardens, these fields, where the scientist Clayton Rue, local expert on phytoremediation, came and began to cultivate this garden for phytoremediation, but also for data that he gathered in order to move on to some other Ford sites. In the end, even though I've met with a lot of opposition to this idea, Ford got a lot of press out of it, and Clayton, Dr. Rue, gathered enough data to be working at a lot of other Ford sites. Where am I? Not here. Anyway, just ground. There it is. When you learn about toxic soils, you can't quite look at dirt ever the same ever again. And when you translate that data to locate the pollution, you really truly see who's in harm's way. You know, poor soils, poor people. And this is unjust ground. Still, I have to say that don't dig, don't test, don't tell is still pretty commonplace. And then if the soils are tested, that conventional remediation kicks in. The hog and haul to somebody else's backyard, and also covering it up. And I kind of like to think that Cornelia, if she was whispering in my ear, would encourage me to persevere and to do the right thing, to champion that transparency, to cultivate some empathy, and make science a superhero. In New Orleans, I collaborated with the artist Mel Chin, and also you can see toxicologist Howard Milkey to address the leaded soils in New Orleans. In this layering of the maps, you can see this is the lead map that I'll show you in a minute, but that, you know, there's the city, and then that's, of course, Katrina. And like Mel said, the lead was the disaster before the disaster. So here's the map. Dr. Milkey hadn't spatialized it yet, so he was quite happy about this, to see exactly what neighborhoods were in peril. And by the way, just a little bit fun fact of knowing what you need to know is that the EPA, our EPA maximum on leaded soils is 400 parts per million. But then you read the research, and in fact, leaded soils are hazardous at 100 parts per million. So you have to kind of wonder what the EPA is prioritizing. We actually took on maybe a little bit of a perverse thing where, you know, with a lot of the properties, the houses being gone, that in fact it was time to rebuild New Orleans from below the ground up, not on top. Oh, this is this funny thing Mel did. So here we go. Here's our operation, Pay Dirt. He worked on a fundraising campaign, and we did the difficult and dirty big mud action. Science, love science. So lead combined with phosphate in this form of apatite 2 becomes pyromorphite, which is a non-bioavailable form of lead. So we basically were talking, and the other part of the recipe was that we would produce sediment. You know, we would lock the lead, and then there'd be sediment, and the sediment was plenty of it at the Bonnet Carré spill wake, and we were looking at different ways via barge, et cetera, to bring it in. So there you see the recipe is locking the lead and then adding the sediment and vegetation. We came up with this idea of a nested scale of operations that goes from extra large mud depot, where the materials would come in from the Bonnet Carré, all the way down to an extra small yard. And that at every level of the scale, there would be different people involved. You know, like our extra large would involve the Army Corps of Engineers and the city, and then down to the extra, the small and extra small, down to neighborhood and community organizations. So there you see this idea that, that again, here it was an action plan, nothing like a master plan, to know how these materials would be distributed throughout the city. So for working traces, I'd say that in all my digging around, site histories, I think it maybe is already obvious, but site histories became absolutely paramount in D.I.R.T's design approach. And I found myself starting to gravitate towards non-toxic, but still very degraded sites, manufacturing or infrastructure like the High Line, with folks in those circumstances living there and living very nearby. Now I had to learn about working with those traces of hard-working sites, and the site forensics became paramount. And the primary act of design in this case became one of finding. And in this case, form becomes more than site-specific. The form is generated from the site and by the site. The approach is difficult, but I took a cue, again, from Cornelia, to be fearless and to be resourceful, to have restraint but not be shy, to swap common sensibility, please, for sensibility abolished, and let design emerge, not descend. I had a really fantastic client who actually let me experiment with this idea. And I mean, that is the great thing about gardens and about smaller scale endeavors, is that level of experimentation that might inform larger projects. So this is the Turtle Creek Waterworks. You can see there's the pump house. This is the spillway right down to the deep creek. Wonderful old waterworks, pumps and tanks, et cetera, that my client, it's shocking that she bought the property before it would get demolished, and another kind of McMansion would be built there, but she rescued it. And there it is. I arrived and kind of was like, wow, all I could do is mess this one up. So, collaborator Kate Orff, folks know Kate Orff, she was my collaborator. So the idea was super simple in terms of this idea of working with what was there, but maybe turning up the volume on some things and turning the volume down on others. But there were the three voids, amazing voids, of the tanks. The idea was just to pull up the adjacent landscapes, the wild landscapes, like a big blanket up around those voids. And the idea was also around the tanks to make this kind of porous ground. And this was the amazing moment where this woman who kind of could afford anything she wanted, I brought her to this concrete, and I said, I'd like for you to consider reusing this. And she goes, I'll be fine with being light on the side. That's my bad Texas. But she was light on the side. I just was like, really? Okay. So there we go. They're lovingly putting into place. I have to say that there one day, I was hearing the crew talk in Spanish, and all of a sudden I heard Barney Rubble. I went, Barney Rubble. Thank you for that. So the namesake started here. Just then, Texas wild plants. Just let it be, let it go. In this case, in the water filter tank you saw, we found the plumbing. You know, we just kind of, like I said, can you find the plumbing and just turn it back on, you know, which she does in very limited ways to not kind of go crazy with water. But this is kind of bringing back the operation of the pump house. How we found it, kept it pretty much the same. Again, we just found the plumbing and turned the water on. And then, actually, Barney Rubble and I traveled to Philadelphia at Urban Outfitters, another amazing client, and the Navy Yard here, where you can see, I think I have a historic photo of League Island, but here you can see that the campus would be right on axis down Broad Street, but it's still, kind of remote. Half of the Navy Yard is active, the other is being redeveloped, but we had the real privilege of working on what they call the historic core. And there you can see League Island with a very early Broad Street. And it actually feels like this today. To today, these amazing battleships that are decommissioned in the basin there. And to think about this place is in terms of a continuum. There was a certain amount of creativity and making, the tradition of making with the Navy, and there on the right is some of the designers from Free People. So pretty big site, really, really large, massive buildings, which I have found that, boy, I have learned a lot about scale working on these projects. I always add a 0 to what I initially think, and just the beautiful grain, and then that's the dry dock that's carved out in the middle there. Here's the dry dock. And these are the kind of graphs that just make me, just kind of slurber. You can see, all the rail lines. This is the crane way. Look at the size of the crane. You can see the size of folks here. But that's the dry dock when it's empty to bring in the ships, to work on the ships. So these are part of the forensics, the really important forensics. And sorry for the quality of this. But this is also a case where, we do an action plan and not a master plan. This is me working with actually the head of fitters, Dick Hayne, and we're just talking about what will structure the landscape to develop over time. And as you can see in red, just became obsessed with the rail lines as a way to structure their campus. And this is what this is what we encountered when we got. And these are the type of things that I get really excited about. See that crack? Oh, does it curve a little bit? So there it was. It was just like 2 inches, of asphalt, over top all of that, beautiful ground. So in this case, in my mind, these places design themselves. Look at that. Like, you couldn't design anything better than that. Not in a million years. So I was like, okay, thank you, boom. So just, they want a dog lawn, because they allow dogs. There's Barney, with some cherries on top, what the heck. And all the other debris that I didn't allow to leave the site. They stockpiled it, so there were sized pieces of concrete, brick, and asphalt. That's my wonderful contractor who learned how to do Barney Rubble like an expert. And there they are. They're having at it. And Barney actually became kind of like part of the kind of the part of urban branding, and it took all sorts of forms here in the garden at Building 543. It's black locust and some wild and woolly things, often left purposely, evidently, to winter over. This is a thing where I think of Dan Kiley, the landscape architect, and he would to this slide, I know he would say, well, he would say, well, I didn't really design this, but I'm going to take all the credit. Over at Anthropology. It was funny because it turned out, I should have brought it, this picture of like the number 2 guy, main dude, in the construction trailer, because on it he had all of the definitions of Barney, and because I'm going to show you, and Bam Bam, the whole family, we got the whole family in there. There's Betty. So Betty was the combination of, concrete and brick. This is a drawing that I would never show Dick Hayne. He was like not into anything like this. He once called me, he goes, "Who do you think you are, Al Gore?" I was like, anyway, so clearly stuck so-called sustainability in the back door. But I think we were at 90% reuse. And in later phases, we actually imported demolition debris from other projects in the yard. That's Betty is underneath here. These long hedgerows that are along the west side of the buildings. And if anybody know who has red hair in the family, Wilma. That's Wilma. Yep, exactly. She's in the house. And a further phase, we went about working on the dry dock and more rails, like here they. And they've become part of the everyday. That's reused, recycled steel walls. In all their iterations. I don't like the idea of runway. And here's a opening day, and this was pretty interesting negotiation with Urban about the dry dock and the nature of the dry dock. I was calling it a park, and and there were all sorts of ways in which I needed to resist anything that felt like it was privatizing the dry dock, number one, because it's the heart of the yard geographically and also historically. So, and these are the moments I love that are very quiet and about letting the ground speak. I got one of the nicest compliments, observations. Someone from Anthropology said to me, the designer, I've always, I now feel like this landscape has always been here, but now I'm a part of it. It's just like, yes. Yep. Okay. Fallow matters. When cities like Detroit, just this image of, I've been working sometimes on singular industrial sites, wanting to expand into thinking about the fallow land that surrounds them, because in fact, this land collateral damage of lost industries and the lost jobs that go along with that. And I would argue that vacant, it's not inert, it's fallow. And by definition, that's laying idle until its next evolution. But in many cities, this land is vulnerable, subject to like carpetbagger developers that they're buying up that's really cheap. to turn a profit, and it's a profit that does not necessarily benefit the residents who have remained there. So I wonder, how is it possible to pose an alternative, one that would create places that were actually authentic and equitable? And how might some of these types of urban wilds and tough parks assert in neighborhoods where they can be valued as novel ecosystems, but also cultural touchstones? I'd say seed optimism. See the fullness in the fallow. Let the wilds keep us civilized, and bring the neighbors along. So my students took on the issue of Detroit's vacancy. They were required to consider it urban dormancy, not vacancy. In the case of Fang Li, the neighborhood that I'm working in, Core City, and how all of the land that's become depopulated was actually this opportunity where you could think of it as parkland, not expensive, but expansive, begin to make for a completely different, I think, type of urbanism. When I got to Core City, here's you can see in the aerial what Fang Li was, this kind of open terrain. And the developer, this amazing developer that was telling me in our first conversation on the phone, he said, I would like to think of and conceive of and work on Core City. I was like, who are you? Really? With his agenda, with his philosophy being landscape is first. They create the there, they bring folks there, and then develop commercial and natural, because it's a place already. So this was the first time. His name's Philip. Philip called me. We stood at this site, a parking lot amongst in Detroit and other manufacturing cities, of these kind of smaller industries that are about one or two stories. And so Philip asked me, he goes, what would you do? I was like, and I asked, and I knew before that there was an old firehouse there. And I said, when was the firehouse raised? And he said, the 70s. And I went, He said, I dig. And then I'm like, oh, did I just say that? Because he had a backhoe the next day on the site. And I said, let's let it emerge. There you see it. It's right along a very busy River Avenue, and small, 100 by 100. This was the day. This was the day where I was like, oh my God, I'm glad. Thank God. Philip is there that it worked, because one day they brought up the cornerstone of the firehouse. And there's Philip, my client, very, very happy that now with that coming up from the ground, that place had an amazing deep, deep story, over 100 years old, older than us, kind of. And there you see it. We basically, every piece of stone that came up, we arranged into different terraces. You can see sometimes small. Here's the day with the neighborhood party. And so all of that came up to make And then the idea then was when we had excavated pits, we would have an urban woodland go and be planted. And this is slag, by the way, this granular stuff. I went kind of shopping in the neighborhood, and we found Philip had this vault, this concrete vault sawn open for years, and I just said, "Oh, perfect! You know, can we float those slabs?" Because I was like, "No furniture, no furniture," you know. And so we just did these floating slabs, which are working out great. People dance on them, they sleep on them, the whole bit. And here's an example of, and this is early when there was we used tan stone, but this was the example of when the backhoe would come over and, well, the excavated places, actually we called this Bam Bam, because he used to come over and just bam these holes out. This is the existing drive that used to exist in the firehouse. And just layers. It's like, you know, I feel like it's cheating. You don't have to design anything. It's just there. And a happy day there. And there you see it. A temporary installation of containers that turned into benches, but there it is. It's kind of like so park became this kind of inaugural public landscape for Philip to now build upon. So I'll be going to Detroit soon, actually, work with him on another park. He calls it Core City Park 2, and some other landscapes. So I want to end by saying how thankful I am to the Cultural Landscape Foundation for being that recipient of the Cornelia Oberlander Prize. It has led to my desire to get on the road like I did. This, my friend Yvonne found this postcard of me getting on the road 30 years ago. So it'll be exactly 30 years ago that I get back on the road, forging kind of a new industrial frontier across America. And so soon, I hope to be spreading words of courage and optimism, Cornelia in tow. Thank you. Prize money sometimes buys interesting things.
We're sorry that you couldn't bring it with you this time.
Pull up in her. I will some other time.
Well, thank you so very much. I just need to comment on the contamination comment.
Okay.
I'm not sure how your contamination was. I've been telling students all day when I had you for studio, more years ago than we need to talk about. I was part of a group of several Master of Architecture students to get an MLA degree. And from my perspective, it was going to make me a better architect. So very quickly, you disabused me of that notion, and I've been team landscape. So
you came to the bright side.
So when you first taught me, I wouldn't have even thought remediation was a word we were using. Like, it was just not in the discourse at that time. So I'm curious, in your 30 years of working on this type of project, what's caused the most significant change? Has it been, change the way society has started to understand environmental issues? Is it more about a kind of change in the way clients receive this information? Has it been about landscape technology? What's really enabled this kind of work and the transformation of it through?
I would say that the main thing is to have, realized or actually bring to light and articulate these landscapes are cultural landscapes. They're not just machines. I mean, when I worked with Ford, that was a real hurdle, and that's why they were like, there was this one guy in Ford, he would say, we would talk about a certain thing, and he'd say, it's inoperative. And he literally was like that, it's inoperative. And I was like, so that was the cue of like, oh, a lot of folks just see it as this machine, and it's like, no, more than that. And of course, that when you say it's a cultural landscape, it's then the social also, so that to me is the shift. And I think for, folks like, the EPA, they have had to acknowledge that. But you can imagine, they're all still scrambling to fix it, so there's still a blind spot there. I also, so that's one thing. The second thing, like you brought up technology, I do think that for folks to, in some ways, the environment almost seems so inert, it's just like it's there. When folks like realize that it was an alive thing, the landscape, that involved landscape systems and da-da-da-da. So that to me is another reason it's like, whoa, if we're gonna fix the landscape holistically, it's gotta involve a knowledge of systems, and these technologies that, are actually more biologically rich, because I think, well, I can't say that everybody does, but there's a good many folks, like when I was on my mining tour 30 years ago, the reclamation laws were just that, just seeing it just as this fixable thing. And many of the reclamation engineers that I met with that were saying that that's becoming a problem, that it's not, they might be environmentally corrected, but they're not ecologically sound. So we had to do these things.
So I have to imagine that in your resourcefulness, you've had to really see the landscape traditions. Well, that's not the right word. The typical methods and means that we might use in our discipline, and you've had some amazing interdisciplinary teams. Would you say that there are particular inventions or things that you've been able to bring to the landscape by borrowing from other disciplines? What?
Science.
Yeah.
It's all about science, Well, I would say science and history. I think, from what I can tell for quite some time, and maybe still, landscape architects do a job with history. They're just wannabes, and they just aren't doing a deep enough, full enough job. So that's one thing, is when I, on projects, I've advocated for a historian, which people think I'm insane, but I advocate for a historian being on the team, because they do the real deal, and reveal a lot. And then scientists, man, they're just, you notice I'm avoiding engineers. I'll leave that be. But yeah, scientists. They're just so cool. Especially when you're, you could see when you're dealing with, if you're dealing with hardcore contaminants, you can't not have a scientist, or an environmental engineer, enlightened one.
When you mentioned education and having to make sure that knowledge was being shared in order to achieve some of your goals, I imagine that bringing in scientists might have seemed odd at various points to different clients. But as you said, if you're talking about contamination, deal with the science of it.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for Clara, but of course I'm blinded by the lights, but I know that other people would like to ask questions, probably more than hearing me, so I'm wondering if I can start to add for some of the questions in the audience. There's Clara over there. Does anybody have a question?
Or comments.
Here we go.
Wonderful presentation, Julie.
Thank you, Claude.
One quick, short question. When you work with scientists and historians in a project, what are you?
What am I?
Yeah.
I'm a landscape architect, all caps.
Plus, I guess the notion there's something more than that.
I know. I think I
Right?
know what you're going at. Yes, translator. That's how I feel.
Well, but I would say that you're also driving to evoke a certain level of a constructed old, new beauty without adding anything else, but you're revealing without any gimmick. And so there's a kind of a big, I could imagine the way that you drive these guys together. There's some ability in you to orchestrate in order to get, like the project in Philadelphia. It's pretty amazing in terms of, as you said, this whole site is there, the history, but once you're there, you feel it, but you're bringing it in the future. So I think you're more than a landscape architect, you're also a visionary. You're kind of doing a little bit of a mise en scène, or, right? And the notion of beauty in allowing the nature to come back in a very, not controlled, but orchestrated way. So is that the kind of an artistic ability added to your landscape?
Yes, the other thing I'm thinking about is I often feel I take on the role of curator.
Yes,
That I'm curating.
that's a good word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other disciplines who have allowed me to see the site, in these kind of other ways. I mean, fantastic dimensions, right?
Yeah.
Make you a better curator.
Yeah, good word.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm actually just wondering, it's more on the, I guess, technical process side, about how you work with contractors and what that process is like, because you were saying, in the project in Detroit, you're just there with the contractor, they're banging holes in the ground. Like, how do you design or not design, and how do you structure your process when part of it is about, I guess, being on site and then just directing people, and what is that like, I guess, and how do you do that?
Yeah. I try to make a point every time I'm working with a contractor to not have it be only instruction, but it's this kind of like I'm talking, with them, and I'm talking about what I'm seeing. I'm talking about, if this, then this, could you, would you, it's sort of like, so I'm explaining the methodology and the thinking, and the good contractors are fantastic. They get it, and I actually can leave. I mean, I have them still send me photographs and stuff, and say, but I've had great success with doing that. But it's taking the time. And actually a lot of times you have to take the time because you're asking them to do something they're not used to, like old dog, new tricks for sure with a lot of them, the demo guy, at Urban, he was like, he just was like, and I was like, I just was like, okay, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I explained to him, the difference between a demolition plan from a salvaging plan. I said, you are now salvaging. You're not demolishing, you know. So it's just that whole kind of getting in there, you know, and yeah.
So maybe to follow up on that, I mean, this is probably not a typical, what we might understand to be the process where there's a whole set of construction drawings and a tender process and hiring in a contractor. Do the contractors have to get brought in on board much earlier in the process?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, right away.
Yeah.
You know, like right away. And it's really, and they go a little cuckoo crazy because they, if they're asked to, budget the job, estimate the job, it's, you know, it's a little bit more difficult. But I've dealt with that before. I've dealt with that with them, you know, because we get into this kind of idea of what the process is, what the methodology is, and how much time. Mm-hmm. You know, we do multiplication that way. But boy, did they come in early.
Because they have to buy in.
Yeah. I mean, Core City was, you know, the contractor was there, you know, the next day, you know. But I mean, and it's pretty unusual. That's that soon. But with the other projects, even urban, you know, it was a conversation with the contractors really early on. I'm remembering in that construction trailer, mm-hmm. you know, because I just said we're going to be doing the salvaging, we're going to be, you know, digging here, and you know, so we had, you know, probably what would be, I guess, the ultimate pre-construction. It's just construction. Meeting.
Questions? No? The end? Do we have the microphone coming? Yes.
Microphone coming.
Todd?
Thank you for existing. You're amazing. Are you an optimist or a pessimist or both? And these days, how does it keep you going or feed your work?
Optimist, all caps. And actually, we were talking to the students about this today, and I was mentioning what hard work being an optimist is. You know, and not this kind of naive optimist, especially, right? Of not being, you know, happy. Hey, I get to do great stuff. I get fed optimism all the time. You know, I mean, are you kidding me? That's why I chose to do this. You know, I you know, to just kind of feel it and like, you know, just have, I mean, like what that woman said to me at Urban, you know, another woman at Urban said to me, she goes, you know, when the cherries are in bloom, I'm 20, and she goes, no, 25% happier. Mm-hmm. I'm like, what? you know, so it's just, you know, just thinking about how what you do can bring on something like that and make that kind of connection over and over again. You know, that to me is the source of optimism. So if anything, the hard work of optimism is to be seeking out those kind of moments. You know, trying to find them, you know, that you could, you know, provide them.
So has there ever been a site that you've gone to where you've just looked at it and said, you know, it's too much, we've caused too much damage, what can I do?
No. No, we can always do something.
Kind of knew that answer.
Well, I mean, it does, you know, it does get, well, no, it's a really good point you bring up, because I think that, you know, when I even look at, you know, the 30 years, and I even look at, like, why the hell did I get that nice Oberlander prize? I've hardly built anything. The fact is that I everything else that I haven't built, I hope has made a difference, you know. I mean, you know, like I was talking earlier today, the students about, you know, the guy at Ford who was the most, talk about a pessimist, you know, and he was in rough shape, man. He was getting beat up by the EPA and everything, you know. And then I was telling him, a few months later after the project, which it was just like a demonstration project, there's nothing permanent there, you know, but it was that moment in time, you know, that you know, created so much optimism, you know. It's gone. I'm like, and I don't care. And Jerry Amber, the guy from Ford, you know, was at the Wildlife Habitat Council conference with me, talking about the project, you know, as his own. I was like, okay. You know, so you know, I mean, I've always thought that, you know, maybe it's part of teaching is, you know, it extends into projects for sure, you know, is teaching and, you know, changing some minds. Mm-hmm. So even if the thing is big and bad and awful, you know, like I showed the copper basin, oh my God, that place, you know, I know that, you know, the folks I worked on at that project brought something that we learned together on that project forward. Mm-hmm. You know, so I was like, okay, question.
I would love to go on a pilgrimage and just visit all of these projects you've shown us. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I was really intrigued with one of the sentences you put up, to kill with knowledge. And I wondered if you could perhaps share a couple of concrete instances where mm-hmm. you've had to go to that step mm-hmm. and what mm-hmm. happened. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I flashed to Ford again because Jerry Amber, the head of the environment group, that couldn't stand me for a long time. We got to be pals, if we can call it that. Yeah, pals. When I showed him that I understood the coking operation, simply that, because before he thought, you know, who are you, you know, little girl? You know, you don't know anything that, you know, you don't know what I'm up against, you know. And but we came back and and actually that was a part of curation thing. When we, a lot of times at contaminated sites, you know, people think it's all contaminated and it's not. So that's the homework you do, right? That's the So when he was like, you don't understand our coking operation, I'm like, yes, we do. And we know, we always say, we know what's hot and we know what's not hot. And because he saw that we understood the flow and the levels of contamination, when we went to go about the process of curating the coke operation, we were totally collaborating then. Because he's like, oh, you know, you know exactly what you're talking about. So, and it was pretty cool. We conserved, you know, a major part of it that a historian told us. Historian tells us the significance of. So there was another layer of turning of knowledge. You know, we hired a historian, and he talked about. You know, here again is Ford. The Ford Rouge plant is the first integrating manufacturing plant in the world. So he's like, we made the argument, like, how could you eliminate a major part of this plant that is part of its legacy, part of its, you know, story and narrative, you know? So, but that was combined with knowing kind of the science and the technology of coke making coke. So, does that answer your question? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for this pleasurable evening.
Great.
I have a two-parter, if I may. Where does the word slurber come from?
What is it?
You
Slurber.
said something about something made you slurber. It was good. Okay, next one is a moment later, you spoke about achieving 90% reuse. And what grabbed me was that later you said you ported in debris.
I what?
You ported in debris.
Oh, yes, we imported some.
And is that common? Or what are the
No.
circumstances in which that might come about?
It's very strange, right? I'll take your garbage. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that was amazing at Urban. You know, I mean, I think that at a project like that, that it's that big, right? Because we learned the lessons at Turtle Creek in Texas, where we got the namesake Barney Rubble. But to expand it into the scale, you know, of Urban, of all that reuse, and also, I mean, it's kind of like, I think that folks around the Navy Yard, the project was very well loved, you know, by the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, the PIDC, that the kind of sensibility, you know, spread, you know, so that when it did come to saying, hey, you know, for this next phase of the project, we need to import, you know, some debris, and that spread, you know, to other projects, and the contractors being like, oh, you know, so the contractors were starting to catch on, like they had something of value, you know, so that was good.
So I think we have our last question right here.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Given your love rejuvenating industrial sites, and especially polluted ones, maybe it's a bit unfair to ask you to comment maybe on some of Michael Hough's work. He didn't, I'm thinking in particular of the brickworks. If you've had the opportunity
No.
to see that.
Yeah.
In the Don Valley here.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
so much a polluted site in the way that
Just
you've been
degraded.
dealing with, but on the other hand, it is an industrial site.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you have any comments on that. You did see it, or you?
I have.
You
I
have
had
seen
years
it.
ago.
And the
I
other one I'd
remember.
like you to comment on, which is talking in terms of taking people's rubbish, the Leslie Street Spit, which has been taking a lot of Toronto's rubbish, in as much as it's all this concrete that they keep knocking down fairly new buildings and wanting to do something with it, so they put it in the lake. I think that it's had a wonderful outcome at the end, but I'd really
Yeah,
like to...
I'm not as familiar
I
with
suppose
that
the
one.
question to you is, you know, are there any principles that you would say, yes, they reflect what you're doing, or would you say, Michael, you could have done much better, you know, why didn't you do this, that, and the other? Anyway,
Okay.
that's enough.
That is. No, it's fine. Do you know that you look like Dan Kiley? Doesn't he? You look like Dan Kiley, who I love, by the way.
Yes.
Okay. Well, look up Dan Kiley. He's fantastic. He's like, you know, a god, you know, in terms of a landscape architect. And I just like swoon once in a while because I saw Dan Kiley I saw him at the American Academy in Rome when I was there, you know, and he just walked down I'm diverging here from the path, and I just was like, wow, you know. And the professor in charge, whatever, he goes, Julie, it's as if you saw God. And I said, I did. So he used to call me Blondie. Hey, Blondie, want to go for a gin and tonic? Anyway, so what I can't say that I know the brickworks that well. All I know is that what the lingering feeling I get is how authentic it felt. that I don't remember anything kind of overdone. You know, it just was, it was just, you know, it just, I don't know if I'm right about that, but I remember feeling like there's new stuff going on here, but I feel like it's just respected. The site was respected. Yeah. And I don't know about the spit, but it sounds really interesting. But yeah, there's a lot to be said about. I haven't used the word respect before. Mm-hmm. That's the right one, I think.
Well, and I definitely think that at the point when Michael was working, the work he was doing was quite groundbreaking at that moment. His interests in ecology and the way that really was at the forefront of his decision-making and design very much made him a god at that moment, in the same way that you described Dan Kiley, and I'm sure as many of the students you spoke with today might remember you fondly in the future. But I think on that note, it's probably a great point to end, and just thank you so very much
Thank you guys.
for sharing with us tonight. Stay for a minute. Dean Du is just going to mention the next events for us.
I would, but I would also like to take the moment to thank Julie again for your wonderful presentation that brings together landscape architecture, design, science, history, through curation and remediation with a ton of dirt and even more humor. Thank you so much. So, for those of you who's fortunate enough to be in this great city of Toronto next week, in our continued celebration of pioneering women in design, next week we will see Phyllis Lambert, who will be joining us from Montreal. She is an architect and founder of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. She will be coming. If you know how youthful she is, you will be very impressed. She will be coming to Toronto to discuss her brand new book. This, puts a lot of fire for all of us who's half her age. She'll be coming to discuss the origins and composition of her latest book. It's published through Lars Mueller Publishers, and the title is "Observation is a Constant That Underlies All Approaches." Something I thought that was quite poetic as some of the affinities of what we've seen today. And that takes place here on Tuesday, March 7th. So we certainly very much hope you can join us for that. And the following evening, as part of, in celebration of the Black History Month and as part of this faculty's Black Futures series, we will be holding the Blackness in Architectural Pedagogy workshop in this room again from 5:30 to 7:30, and that'll be Wednesday on the 8th. We will see presentations from two speakers, Michael Lee Poi of OCAD University, as well as Jerome Harford from the City University of New York and Dark Matter University. So for more information on both of these very exciting events and the rest of our exciting public lectures events, I hope you will get to our website and take a look, and hopefully that will entice you enough to sign up. As someone was asking me, Daniel's faculty does have a YouTube channel. For those of you who have not been able to attend the past lectures, such as our last year's annual Hough OALA lecture, it is actually on the YouTube channel of Daniel's faculty website. So you can go there to take a look at the lecture that was there last year. So with that, I would like to thank you everyone for coming. It's great to see students and supporters and faculties here all together. I would like to invite everyone to enjoy part of the reception that will be right to your door, to my right, and to be able to celebrate after all of these few years the intimacy and pleasure of being in each other's physical company. Thank you very much.